The canvas skin of the Piper L4 Grasshopper drummed against the aluminum airframe, a rhythmic, frantic heartbeat that matched the pulse in Major Charles Carpenter's neck as he pushed the throttle forward. It was 14:12 on September 19, 1944, and the sky over Lorraine, France, was thick with the acrid black smoke of burning American armor. Through the scratched plexiglass of his cockpit, the 31-year-old history teacher didn't just see a battlefield, he saw a massacre in progress. Below him, churning through the mud at 12 miles per hour, was a 60-ton PZKPFW-6 Tiger tank, a monster of hardened Krupp steel that had just incinerated a squad of U.S. infantrymen. Carpenter was flying a plane that weighed less than 1,200 pounds fully loaded, a glorified kite made of fabric, plywood, and repurposed bicycle parts. He had no armor plating, no self-sealing fuel tanks, and a top speed that was slower than a Grand Prix car. According to every manual in the United States Army Air Force, his job was to observe, radio coordinates, and run away. But Charles Carpenter wasn't running today. He banked the frail aircraft sharply to the left, the G-force pressing him into his thinly padded seat, and lined up the nose of his plane directly at the Tiger's rear exhaust vents. Mounted on the delicate wing struts of his aircraft, held in place by nothing more than rusted bolts and baling wire, were 6 M1 infantry bazookas. This was an insanity that defied physics. The backblast from a single bazooka was enough to tear the fabric off a wing. Firing 6 was structurally suicidal. But Carpenter didn't care about structural integrity. He cared about the German tank commander who was currently rotating his 80mm cannon toward a pinned-down platoon of GIs. Carpenter reached up to the makeshift toggle switch panel he had wired himself, a crude assembly of copper and electrical tape dangling above the dashboard, and flipped the safety. He was 100 meters off the ground and dropping fast. The German commander popped the hatch, looking up in confusion at the buzzing insect descending upon him, realizing too late that this particular insect had grown a deadly set of stingers. To understand how a mild-mannered high school teacher ended up diving a fabric plane into the teeth of the Wehrmacht's heavy armor, you have to understand the desperate reality of the observation pilot. Charles Bazooka Charlie Carpenter hadn't been bred for war. Before 1941, his biggest conflict had been getting high school students in Moline, Illinois, to care about the Roman Empire. He was an academic, a football coach, a man who understood history as something you read about in books, not something you bled into the mud. When he enlisted, his age and health kept him out of the cockpits of P-51 Mustangs or P-47 Thunderbolts. The Army, in its infinite wisdom, looked at the steady, reliable teacher and put him in the L4 Grasshopper, the military version of the Piper Cub. It was a plane designed for Sunday afternoon joyrides, not the hellscape of the Western Front. The problem was strictly mechanical and terrifyingly simple. The L4 was slow, low, and loud. Its mission was to hover over the front lines, spot German artillery positions, and radio them back to American howitzers. It was effective, but it had a fatal flaw: the time-to-impact gap. From the moment Carpenter spotted a German tank to the moment an artillery shell could land on it, anywhere from 4 to 10 minutes would pass. In war, 10 minutes is a lifetime. Carpenter watched helplessly for months as German panzer divisions exploited this gap. He would spot a Tiger or Panther tank moving through a hedgerow, radio the coordinates, and watch in frustration as the tank simply relocated before the artillery barrage arrived. The Germans weren't stupid. They knew the L4s were unarmed. German soldiers would often stand in the open and wave mockingly at the observation planes, knowing the pilots could do absolutely nothing to hurt them. They treated Carpenter like a nuisance fly, annoying but harmless. That mockery gnawed at Carpenter. It ate away at him every time he landed at the muddy airstrip near Lorient and had to write a report detailing American casualties he had seen but couldn't prevent. The breaking point came in late August 1944. Carpenter had watched a German armored column ambush an American supply truck. The Germans didn't just destroy the truck, they took their time, using heavy machine guns to cut down the drivers as they fled. Carpenter had screamed coordinates into his radio, begging for fire support, but the batteries were out of range. He circled overhead, gripping the stick until his knuckles turned white, forcing himself to watch good men die because his plane lacked a trigger. That night, Carpenter walked into the maintenance tent, his eyes scanning the chaotic piles of equipment. He wasn't looking for engine parts or fabric patches. He was looking for something kinetic. His eyes landed on a crate of M1 bazookas dropped by a supply truck. The M1 was a handheld anti-tank weapon, a steel tube that fired a 2.36-inch shaped charge rocket capable of punching through 3 inches of armor plate. It was heavy, clunky, and designed to be fired from a soldier's shoulder. Carpenter picked one up, feeling the 13-pound weight of the steel tube. He looked at the weapon, then looked at the fragile wing struts of his parked L-4 Grasshopper. The mechanics thought he had lost his mind. "You want to do what, Major?" Technical Sergeant Simmons asked, wiping grease from his hands with a dirty rag. "I want to strap these to the struts," Carpenter said, his voice flat and serious. 3 on each wing. Wire the ignition triggers into the cockpit." Simmons laughed, a sharp barking sound. "Major, with all due respect, that fabric is grade A cotton. The backblast from a bazooka rocket throws out a flame tongue 6 feet long. You fire that thing mid-air, you won't shoot the tank. You'll set your own damn wing on fire and burn all the way to the ground." "Then we shield it," Carpenter replied, grabbing a piece of scrap metal from a destroyed Jeep. "We wrap the struts in asbestos cloth. We angle the tubes outward so the blast clears the fuselage." The engineering challenge was a nightmare of improvisation. The L-4's electrical system was a simple 6-volt setup, barely enough to run the radio and the lights. The M1 bazooka required an electrical charge to ignite the rocket's propellant. Carpenter and Simmons spent 3 sleepless nights rewiring the entire cockpit. They stripped copper wire from a downed German radio truck, running the leads from the cockpit, out the window, and taping them along the wing struts. They didn't have specialized aviation mounting brackets. They used what they had: U-bolts from a hardware kit and heavy-gauge baling wire, the kind farmers used to bundle hay. They physically lashed the bazookas to the wing struts, tightening the bolts until the metal groaned. It looked ridiculous. The sleek, albeit simple lines of the Piper Cub were now marred by these ugly, dark steel tubes jutting out like cancerous growths. Weight was the next critical failure point. 6 bazookas plus rockets added nearly 150 pounds of drag and dead weight to a plane that struggled to lift 2 people. When they loaded the rockets for the first time, the L-4's landing gear compressed visibly, the tires bulging under the new strain. On September 10th, Carpenter taxied out for the test flight. The airfield was silent. Mechanics, pilots, and infantrymen stopped what they were doing to watch the Mad Major kill himself. The L-4 lumbered down the grass strip, the engine screaming at maximum RPM. It didn't want to fly. It bounced, settled, bounced again, and finally, agonizingly, clawed its way into the air, clearing the tree line by less than 15 feet. Carpenter climbed to 1,500 feet, the plane handling like a brick in a mudslide. The aerodynamics were ruined. The bazookas created massive drag, pulling the nose down. He had to fight the stick constantly just to keep level. He spotted a solitary German armored car abandoned in a field, a perfect target. He dove. The airspeed indicator rattled past 100 miles an hour, the airframe shuddering violently. At 200 yards, he flipped the first toggle switch. Whoosh! The recoil wasn't the problem. The problem was the smoke. The rocket leaped from the tube with a deafening roar, leaving a trail of white phosphorus smoke that instantly blinded him. The plane bucked as the weight dropped from the left wing, throwing him into a skid. Carpenter fought the controls, his visibility reduced to 0 for 3 terrifying seconds. When the smoke cleared, he looked down. The rocket had missed the armored car by 50 yards, exploding harmlessly in a ditch. The vibration had loosened the wiring on the remaining 5 tubes. The stupid trick had failed. But Charles Carpenter saw something else. He saw the potential. The rocket had fired. The wing had not burned. The plane was still flying. The failure wasn't the idea. The failure was the aim. He needed to get closer. Much closer. Over the next week, he refined the madness. He adjusted the convergence angle of the tubes, aiming them slightly downward to match the plane's dive profile. He practiced diving steep and pulling out late. He realized that to hit a tank, he couldn't fire from 500 yards. He had to be within 100 yards, point-blank range in aviation terms. He christened the plane Rosie the Rocketer. The escalation began on September 15th. Carpenter was on patrol near Nancy when he spotted a column of German infantry supported by 2 Stück KFZ, 251 half-tracks. Usually he would have called it in. Instead, he cut the engine to idle, gliding silently over the treetops. The Germans didn't hear him until he was 300 feet away. He fired 2 rockets in a salvo. One went wide. The second slammed into the lead half-track. The shaped charge detonated with a brilliant flash, punching through the thin armor and igniting the fuel tank. The vehicle erupted into a fireball. The German infantry scattered, terrified not by a squadron of P-47s, but by a single, flimsy observation plane that had suddenly grown claws. Carpenter pulled up, his engine roaring back to life, leaving chaos in his wake. But half-tracks were soft targets. The real test, the test that would determine if this was a suicide pact or a revolution, came 4 days later at Aricourt. The Battle of Aricourt was the largest tank battle on the Western Front, involving the U.S. Army. The Germans launched a massive counterattack with over 260 tanks, trying to shatter the Third Army's flank. The weather was foggy, grounding the heavy fighter bombers. The GIs on the ground were on their own, except for Charlie Carpenter. He took off into the soup, visibility less than a mile. He was hunting. He spotted a company of German tanks using the fog to flank an American position. At the head of the column was a Panther tank, 45 tons of sloped armor, and death. Carpenter didn't hesitate. He rolled Rosie the Rocketer onto her side and dove. This wasn't a strafing run. It was a joust. The German machine gunners on the tank spotted him. Green tracers zipped past his cockpit, tearing through the fabric wings with the sound of ripping canvas. Zip, zip, zip. He could hear the bullets passing inches from his head. He didn't flinch. He focused entirely on the engine deck of the Panther. 150 yards. 100 yards. He flipped all remaining switches. 4 rockets launched in a ripple fire. The plane bucked wildly, the smoke enveloping the cockpit. Carpenter yanked the stick back, the landing gear of his Piper Cub scraping the leaves of the tree line as he pulled out of the dive. He banked hard to look back. 2 of the rockets had struck the Panther. One hit the turret ring, jamming it. The other punched through the rear engine deck. Smoke was pouring from the tank. The crew was bailing out, their uniforms on fire. He had done it. He had killed a main battle tank with a fabric plane, but the celebration lasted exactly 3 seconds. A loud crack echoed through the fuselage. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. A stray piece of shrapnel from the exploding tank, or perhaps a lucky rifle shot from the ground, had severed his fuel line. The propeller windmilled to a halt. The silence was sudden and absolute, broken only by the rushing wind. Carpenter was 200 feet in the air, gliding over enemy territory, with a dead engine and 6 empty steel tubes dragging him down. Below him, the rest of the German tank column was turning their turret machine guns upward. The history teacher looked at his altimeter, then at the field of mud ahead. He wasn't a pilot anymore. He was a falling object. Chapter 2. The Impossible Ace. The silence was the loudest thing Major Charles Carpenter had ever heard. With the Continental A-65 engine dead, the vibration that usually rattled his teeth was gone, replaced by the terrifying whistle of wind over slack canvas and the thwack, thwack, thwack of German Mauser rounds punching holes through his fuselage. He was 180 feet above the mud, dropping at a rate of 800 feet per minute, with a squadron of angry German infantrymen sprinting to meet his arrival. Carpenter didn't have time to pray. He had physics to solve. He shoved the stick forward, trading his precious remaining altitude for just enough airspeed to keep the wings from stalling. The field ahead was a cratered mess of artillery churn, barbed wire, and unexploded ordnance. It wasn't a runway, it was a graveyard. Carpenter wrestled the sluggish controls, aiming for a narrow strip of green between 2 shell holes. At 45 miles per hour, Rosie the Rocketer slammed into the French soil. The landing gear screamed as the tires sank 6 inches into the muck, snapping the plane violently to the right. The left wingtip caught a fence post, tearing a 3-foot gash in the fabric, but the plane didn't flip. It skidded to a halt just 50 yards from an American forward observation post. Carpenter kicked open the flimsy door and tumbled out into the mud, his Colt .45 drawn. But the only people running toward him were GIs, cheering like they had just watched Babe Ruth point to the fences. They dragged him and his battered plane behind the safety of a hedgerow, just as German mortar rounds began to bracket the landing site. Most pilots would have taken this as a sign from God to stop. Most pilots would have looked at the shredding fabric, the severed fuel line, and the near-death landing, and requested a transfer back to artillery spotting. Charles Carpenter was not most pilots. He was a history teacher who had realized he could make history instead of just teaching it. Within 3 hours, he had mechanics patching the fuel line with rubber hose and covering the bullet holes with duct tape and fresh dope. By 17 that same evening, he was back in the air. He wasn't done. He was just getting calibrated. Over the next 10 days, the Mad Major went on a rampage that would become legendary in the Third Army. He treated his aircraft not like a plane, but like a flying shotgun. On September 20th, he spotted a column of German supply trucks moving through a dense forest near Nancy. The canopy was too thick for artillery to be effective. The shells would detonate in the treetops. Carpenter dropped Rosie to 30 feet above the branches, so low that the slipstream from his propeller shook the leaves. He drifted behind the lead truck, a heavy Opel Blitz carrying ammunition. He was flying at 75 miles per hour. The truck was doing 40. The closure rate was agonizingly slow. He waited until he could clearly see the rivets on the truck's tailgate. At 60 yards, he fired the starboard battery. Whoosh! Crack! The rocket struck the rear axle. The shaped charge didn't just disable the truck, it detonated the cargo. The explosion was so violent that the shock wave punched Rosie upward, rattling Carpenter's teeth and cracking his altimeter glass. He fought for control as debris rained down around him, pieces of burning wood and jagged metal falling slower than his plane was flying. He had to dodge the wreckage of his own kill. But the Germans were learning. They realized that the buzzing insect above them was no longer harmless. By September 24th, German tank commanders had issued a new directive: shoot the Piper Cubs. The hunter became the hunted. On the morning of September 25th, Carpenter located a Panther tank hiding in a barn with the roof blown off. It was a perfect ambush position covering a vital crossroads. As Carpenter rolled in for his run, the Panther didn't button up. Instead, the commander stayed open, firing his pintle-mounted MG-34 machine gun directly at the incoming plane. 7.92-millimeter bullets shredded the air around Carpenter. One round smashed through the plexiglass windscreen, missing his left ear by 2 inches, embedding itself in the rear spar. Another severed the control cable for his rudder. The pedals went limp at his feet. Carpenter didn't abort. He couldn't. If he pulled up now, he would present the tank with a slow, fat belly target. He was committed. Without rudder control, he couldn't yaw the nose to aim finely. He had to bank the entire plane, using ailerons to skid the aircraft into alignment. It was sloppy, desperate flying. At 80 yards, fighting a plane that wanted to drift sideways, he fired all remaining tubes. 4 rockets spiraled out. 2 missed, exploding in the stone walls of the barn. 1 hit the ground in front of the tank, but the 4th rocket, the one that counted, struck the Panther's engine grating. The explosion was contained inside the stone walls, amplifying the blast. The tank's engine compartment caught fire immediately. The crew bailed out into the waiting guns of the U.S. 4th Armored Division. Carpenter limped back to base, flying the plane with stick and throttle alone, the rudder flapping uselessly in the wind. When he landed, his mechanic counted 12 fresh bullet holes in the fuselage. "Major," the mechanic said, pulling a piece of German lead out of the seat cushion, "you are statistically supposed to be dead." Carpenter just ordered the cables replaced. He had more work to do. The climax of his one-man war came on September 28th. Intelligence reported a pair of Tiger I tanks blocking the advance near the Perroy Forest. The Tiger was the apex predator of 1944, 4 inches of frontal armor, an 80mm cannon that could kill anything the Americans had from a mile away. A bazooka rocket could not penetrate a Tiger's front armor. It would bounce off like a pebble. Carpenter knew the math. To kill a Tiger, he had to hit the rear, where the armor was only 80mm thick, or the top of the turret or engine deck, where it was even thinner. He had to attack from a vertical angle or from behind. He found them parked in a defensive V formation, watching the road. They were expecting Shermans. They weren't expecting a history teacher dropping out of the sun. Carpenter climbed to 3,000 feet, an agonizingly slow ascent for the underpowered Cub. He positioned himself directly up-sun, blinding the German gunners. Then he cut the throttle completely. He pushed the nose over into a near-vertical dive. The engine was silent, the propeller spinning lazily in the wind. Rosie became a stealth glider. The wind roared as speed built up, 90, 100, 110 miles per hour. The fabric wings ballooned, threatening to rip from the spars. The wires holding the bazookas hummed like guitar strings. He pulled out of the dive at 200 feet, silently gliding over the rear of the Tigers. The German crews were looking forward, scanning the tree line for tanks. They never heard him. Carpenter unleashed everything. 6 rockets in a massive salvo. The recoil was so strong, it stalled the plane in midair. For a heart-stopping second, Rosie hung motionless, suspended by physics and willpower. Below, hell opened up. 2 rockets struck the rear of the left Tiger. The shaped charges burned through the engine deck, igniting the fuel and ammunition. The turret blew off with a force that flipped the massive 60-ton vehicle onto its side. The second Tiger began to turn its turret, searching for the attacker. Carpenter slammed the throttle forward, the engine coughing back to life, and dove toward the tree line, using the smoke from his kill as cover. He had destroyed the unkillable beast with $12 worth of rockets and a roll of baling wire. By the time the Third Army relieved the sector, the score was official. In 10 days, Major Charles Carpenter had destroyed 6 German tanks, including 2 Tigers, and over a dozen armored cars. He was officially credited as an ace, a title usually reserved for fighter pilots who shot down 5 enemy planes. But Carpenter hadn't shot down planes. He had killed tanks. The reaction from the German side was a mixture of confusion and terror. Captured German soldiers asked their interrogators about the secret American weapon, the silent bomber that appeared from nowhere. They couldn't believe it was just a Piper Cub. They assumed it was a new advanced attack aircraft. When shown a picture of an L-4, one German officer reportedly spat on the ground and said, That is a toy. You are lying." General George S. Patton, a man who loved aggression more than life itself, heard about the crazy major with the bazookas. He personally drove to the airfield to see the contraption. Patton walked around Rosie the Rocketer, poking the duct-taped holes, inspecting the crude wire mounts. He looked at Carpenter, who was standing at attention, covered in oil and mud. "Some of my people think you're crazy, Major," Patton growled. "But you're the kind of crazy I like. You've got more guts than half my colonels." Patton awarded him the Silver Star on the spot. The statistical impact of Carpenter's innovation was staggering. An L-4 Grasshopper cost the U.S. government approximately $800 to manufacture. A German Tiger tank cost the equivalent of $300,000 and thousands of man-hours to build. Carpenter was trading pennies for gold bars. But the real number wasn't the dollars. It was the lives. Every tank Carpenter destroyed was a tank that didn't fire its 80mm cannon into a squad of American infantry. Based on standard casualty rates, a single operational Tiger tank could account for 20 to 50 infantry casualties in a defensive engagement. By destroying 6, plus the armored cars, Carpenter likely saved between 200 and 300 American lives in 10 days. He flew until the end of the war. In 1945, dragging a severe illness he had ignored for months, he was finally grounded. The illness turned out to be Hodgkin's disease. He had been fighting Nazis while his own body was fighting cancer. After the war, the Mad Major returned to the quiet life he had left. He went back to Urbana, Illinois, and resumed teaching history. He walked the halls of the high school, a quiet, unassuming man in a tweed jacket. His students knew him as Mr. Carpenter, the guy who graded essays on the French Revolution. They had no idea that the man teaching them about Napoleon had once dove a fabric kite into a formation of Tiger tanks. Carpenter didn't brag. He didn't write a memoir. When asked about the war, he would simply say, "I did what I had to do." He died in 1966 at the age of 53, the cancer finally claiming the pilot the Luftwaffe couldn't catch. But his legacy changed warfare forever. Charles Carpenter proved that close air support didn't require heavy bombers or fast fighters. He proved that a slow, loitering aircraft, intimately connected to the ground battle, could be more lethal than a high-altitude bomber. His stupid wire trick was the spiritual ancestor of the A-1 Sky Raider in Vietnam and the A-10 Warthog in the Cold War. Every time an attack helicopter pops up from behind a tree line to fire a missile at a tank, it is following the flight path carved by a history teacher who strapped bazookas to a bicycle with baling wire. Rosie the Rocketer was eventually found in a barn in Austria after the war, lost for decades. In 2020, after years of restoration, she flew again. The restorers left the U-bolts on the wings. They left the scars. Because you can fix fabric, but you can't erase history. Charles Carpenter wasn't a superhero. He was a man who looked at a problem, German tanks killing his friends, and looked at the tools he had, wire, bolts, and a slow plane, and decided that the rules of engagement didn't apply to him anymore. He proved that courage is just the willingness to ignore the odds when the math says you're going to die. And he did it all while the rest of the world thought he was just flying a kite. If this story of the history teacher who hunted tigers blew your mind, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell right now. We upload new, incredible stories of forgotten heroes every single day, and you don't want to miss the next one. Like the video to help us keep these memories alive. See you in the next one.